Conversations with Cele on WNNZ.
Good morning and welcome. Have you ever heard someone say he's a born salesman? Well, maybe he was. Do square pegs end up in round holes? Have you ever met someone who always wanted to be an architect or a banker or a doctor or a newspaper editor, and they trained all their life, went to college, had years of experience, and either hated it or just weren't very good at it, or perhaps full of stress? Well, our guest this morning is Stephen M. Darter, President of People Management in Simsbury, Connecticut. And People Management and Steve Darter help people and organizations be sure they're matched for each other and for the job. Now, how, you may ask? Well, they have a process that helps you find your abilities and what motivates you. And results show that the best predictor of the future is the past, and the behavior of an individual is consistent. Now, I'm sure you're confused. Maybe we all are. But Steve Darter, welcome.
Good morning, Cele. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How would you describe your job? What does people management do?
People management helps organizations to more effectively utilize their employees, the people, and it also helps people to more effectively utilize their own natural strengths and their natural abilities.
As president of People Management, what do you do? How do you get involved?
Oh, I get involved in a variety of ways. We mostly work with corporations and people in corporations, and we really end up responding to problems that relate to people. For example, if a company is looking to hire somebody, and it's a very important hire and a very critical hire, they may present to us several people that they'd want us to look at, to evaluate, to assess, to determine whether indeed they are good fits for the position that they're considering. Sometimes there may be an employee in the company that the company wants to keep, and the individual is not performing well, and the company doesn't want to fire the person, and they want to get a better handle on what motivates this person, how they can more effectively utilize this individual. And so they ask us to get involved with the person and bring whatever insight we can bring to that individual, and to them as well.
I guess the question would be, how does Steve Darter know that you're suited for the job you're in?
Oh, I guess because I wake up Monday mornings sometimes and I pinch myself and I can't believe I get paid to do what I do. And when you can have that kind of feeling about the work that you do, then you know you're well suited. Plus, I've been doing it for 15 years and have a lot of repeat customers, and I guess that indicates that I do it well, I guess, or at least I enjoy what I'm doing.
And I know that I read a couple things, and I think your company was rated number 20 out of the top 50 companies in Hartford last year by the Chamber?
Yes, last year, I guess the Chamber and KPMG, Pete Marwick, do an evaluation of companies, and we came out as the 20th most successful privately owned company in the greater Hartford region last year.
And personally, you were recognized as one of the top 200 executive recruiters in the country in a book called The Career Makers.
Yes, I'm not quite sure how that really came about, but I was surprised that, to learn that I was rated in the top 200, and it was based upon surveys of senior human resource executives and CEOs in I think it's 2,000 organizations, and I got rated as the top 200, and I guess they're coming out with a revised edition of the book, and they've contacted me again and indicated that again I was nominated. I don't know where I'll end up coming. I'm hoping, but who knows for sure.
When I think of management recruitment or the field you're in general, I think of the word headhunter. Does that apply in this instance?
Yeah, to some extent. Headhunting is a phrase that people use, and that's certainly one of the primary activities that I'm involved in, and our company is involved in. Headhunting is a misnomer to some extent in that the industry is very broad. And so on one end, you have what's referred to as contingency search work, where companies don't pay a consultant until they actually hire somebody, actually land the person. We really get hired and paid on a consultant fee up front or on an hourly rate to go out when we're doing search work, to go out and to kind of scan the universe and find appropriate candidates and help to put them in the positions. Generally, we're working at very senior levels, generally positions of 70, 80, 90,000, or above. Last year, actually, our average salary of the executives that we ended up doing search work for was a little bit over $120,000. So the search work tends to be at a very high level as opposed to a mid-management or an individual contributor level.
Steve Darter is president of People Management in Simsbury, Connecticut. His organization has a process for finding out what people's abilities are and to make sure that these people are going to fit. We're going to find out about that process after these messages. And we continue with our guest, the president of People Management in Simsbury, Connecticut, Stephen M. Darter. Steve, tell me about the process whereby your company, in effect, is sure that a certain person will fit the job or a certain person can be moved into a job that will fit. What's the process? How do you find out what people really can do?
Well, the process is one that we've been evolving and pioneering and developing for the last 30 years. And it was developed by the founder of our organization, Arthur Miller. And some of us have been working with it now, for 20, 30 years in trying to refine it and develop it. And basically what we're saying about people and what we believe about people is that people seem to either be born with or develop early in life a very natural way of doing things. And you can look at people, for example, we were talking before we went on the air about your two children and how they're different. And most parents, when they look at their kids, they're different. They recognize that they're different and seemingly different from birth. And as a parent, you try to adjust to that. If you sit down and you talk to a manager in a company, he or she recognizes that his employees or her employees are different. One person is perhaps more conceptual, one person is more detail-oriented, one person is very team-oriented and always wants to involve themselves with others, and some person always wants to go in a room and be by themselves. If you look at yourself and the jobs that you've had or the position that you have now, there's certain kind of work that even though it might be important and a priority, tends to go towards the bottom of the pile, and you only do it when you really need to get to it. But there's other part of work that you seem to gravitate towards. You enjoy doing that part, and even though it may not be the most important priority, it tends to go to the top of the pile. And so we recognize those differences. We were talking on the phone before I came down about the twin studies out of the University of Minnesota, where they've looked at identical twins, for example, who were separated at birth, and here it is 20 or 30 or 40, sometimes even 50 years later, and they're reuniting these identical twins, and they're discovering incredible similarities, in them. And so the question is, how much does our environment influence, and how much does nature influence? And it's not one or the other. It's really that we seem to find that people are very predisposed to having certain kind of natural abilities. And so we've evolved a process that says people can't be categorized into one of 4 types, of 1 of 6 types, or 1 of 8 types, or 1 of 12 types. What we say is that everybody is unique. Everybody is different. Everyone is like a snowflake or a thumbprint. And what we're trying to do is to identify, define, or capture that uniqueness and help organizations, again, to understand the uniqueness of each person so they can more effectively utilize them, and help the people themselves, the person themselves, understand their uniqueness so they can make smarter and wiser decisions regarding their own career.
Reading some of the materials that People Management provided makes me want to ask you, what were you like as a kid? What made you happy when you were a little kid, and how does that relate to what you're doing today?
That's an interesting question. I played a lot of sports when I was a kid. But what I liked playing in particular, and for people who play basketball, I never enjoyed shooting. I was a person who would like to be the point guard, and I'd like to survey the floor, for example, and I'd like to set up plays so other people can score. I end up doing a lot of coaching. I coached basketball, and I participated in coaching, Little League and baseball. And so there's a theme in my life, for example, in terms of coaching and sparking and triggering people. I like doing seminars and presentations where I stand up, before groups, and I get them involved and I get them excited, or at least I try to get them involved and excited. So sports was very important to me. As a kid, I ended up reading a lot of psychology books. Didn't necessarily read the school books that I was supposed to read, but I ended up reading a lot of psychology books. And I remember in particular a book I read called The 50-Minute Hour when I was about, 8 or 9 years old, and it really drew my interest. And we see these kinds of themes, for example, in kids that evolve over their lives. We see things that they do as children relate to what their interests are and what we refer to as their motivated patterns are as adults, for example.
What motivated you then that has carried through now? You're obviously the team player, that means, and the organizer, so you go into companies and you help them get organized to find the right person. You're looking for the right basketball player for them.
Also very service-oriented. One of the achievements when we talk about our technology, one of the achievements I had is I worked at beach clubs on Long Island, and I worked as a cabana boy, and I got the single highest tip ever. I got a $500 tip.
What'd you do for $500?
Well, it was actually two cabanas that had 32 kids between them, and I used to really service all the parents and take care of the kids, and I would carry chairs and tables down to the shore and then go down there and find out what drinks they wanted, and then I would. And so providing services is something that's very, very important as well, and it's been a theme in terms of the things that I've enjoyed doing. And so I end up, here it is 15 years later, and I'm in a position that involves people, that involves why I'm on the radio with you. I'm trying perhaps to spark more of an interest, representing what our technology and our process is, and also with an organization that very firmly believes in providing as top quality services we can possibly provide.
The Arthur Miller, the founder of the company, yes. How did he come upon this process, which we'll get into then, and what the process is of discovering what people are?
Okay. Art is actually a lawyer by training, and when he graduated from Northwestern University, he ended up going to Argonne National Laboratories as the director of personnel. And Argonne National Laboratories is connected with the University of Chicago, and it's a major national research laboratory working on a lot of government work. From there he went to Raytheon, and then he ended up at Combustion Engineering back in the mid-50s as the business manager for the nuclear group. And along that time period, he got involved in a new concept that was beginning to emerge called success factor analysis. And it was really the forerunner of all of this, in that rather than looking at people and assuming that perhaps they're blank sheets of paper that you can write on, which is a very behavioral kind of approach to looking at people, they started looking, this process called success factor analysis was starting to look at people in terms of the successes that they've had in their lives and beginning to make some predictions in terms of off of that success. As Art began to look at that, he saw greater implications for it. And actually he ended up leaving Combustion Engineering, and he left it specifically to develop this whole process and this technology. In order to eat, he actually formed an executive search firm, but his real passion and his real heart was in developing this technology, and that's what he did. And then he involved others in the process, and it evolved.
The process is called SIMA. What does that stand for? SIMA.
SIMA is the acronym. SIMA stands for the System for Identifying Motivated Abilities.
How does it work? What are you looking for? How do you find these factors?
Well, it's really very simple on the surface, and it gets more complex when you sit sort of on our side of the fence. But essentially, as I indicated before, we believe that people are either born with or they develop early in life a very natural way of doing things. We call that a motivated abilities pattern. And what we do is we ask people to generate a list of achievements. And these would be situations that they've been in where they've done something that they've enjoyed doing and felt that they've done well. And we ask them to take a couple from when they were a kid, a teenager, a young adult, however old that they are, and we interview the person on a lot of these achievements, maybe 8, 9, 10, or 11, or 12 of them. And in essence, we're attempting to find out what was happening that was giving this person this tremendous sense of satisfaction and success. And the way that we do it is half of it is in the interview process itself. It's not a very aggressive interview. It's actually a very passive interview. In a normal interview, you'd expect somebody like us to ask probing questions. Did you do this or did you do that? But we're really very passive. What we're doing is saying, here's your achievement. Here's what you wrote down as your achievement. Tell me about it. And the person begins to start rambling on about what they did, how they got involved in it, and etc. And then as they come to words like I built, I designed, I managed, I planned, I communicated, I beat up the bully, I climbed the mountain, I hit the home run, whatever it is that they're saying, theoretically we stop them and we say how. How did you build it? How did you design it? How did you plan it? How did you write the material? How did you create it in your mind? Whatever it is that they're saying that they do. And what happens as we begin to see a theme emerge early in life, and it just stays very, very constant throughout that person's life. And what we say to the individual when we describe the themes to them, we say, this is the kind of stuff that's given you this tremendous sense of satisfaction and success in the past. You ought to look for work that allows you to use as much of this as you possibly can in the future. And what we say to our clients, companies that we work for, is that if we can help you to define the kind of person that you're looking for, you're much better off, assuming that people are technically equal, you're much better off hiring a person whose natural style fits in with the way you want it to fit in. If you look at people in work, for example, people rarely fail in a job because of their a lack of technical knowledge and experience. People mostly don't perform well in a job because of the style that they bring to the position. And that's why you can have someone who is labeled as a poor performer in one organization who becomes a hero in another organization, because it has to do with the culture of that company, or has to do with the relationship with the manager or the expectations of the position. And even though the titles can be the same, the position can be substantially different and make it a poor fit. So that's our process or our technology. Now what we do when we interview a person, most of the time we end up taping. We tape this achievement interview that generally goes somewhere between an hour and a half and maybe 2.5 hours. We tape it and then we transcribe the tape. And then one of our case writers sits down and writes a report that captures the themes that we see. And the report basically is broken into 5 pieces or 5 categories. Now they're not types as much as what they are ways to capture the observations that we see. In essence, what we're doing is we're looking at the phenomena of an individual, what's unique about this person, and we're just trying to capture it as best as we can in writing. And what we see is that there are certain abilities that the person is motivated to use. Organize, for example, communicate, listen, to create, to develop, for example, would be examples of certain kind of abilities. That doesn't mean that they can't use other abilities, but these are sort of the gold nuggets that a person almost never gets tired of. For example, I would venture to guess collecting information through interviewing would be an example of a very strong motivated ability, for you. And then there's certain subject matter that the person is motivated to use. So the person likes to use certain abilities on specific subject matter, for example, whether it be people or organizations or technology, for example.
So I might prefer to interview people like you about sociological phenomena where I hate politics.
Yeah, well, it depends on how motivated you are by people, but yeah, that might be an example. For example, a person might, you look at students, why is someone particularly interested in history but not interested in math, or very interested in math and not interested in history, is an example. People who are very interested in people, for example, like myself, I'm not inherently interested in a lot of technology, for example, yet I end up working with a lot of scientists and engineers, and I'm interested in them as people, and hence I become interested in their technology. If you remove them from the equation, then I'm not inherently interested in the science outside of them, and so it's the person that I'm much more interested in.
So you've taught, first of all, you try and find out things they enjoy,
Yep.
things that they've enjoyed repeatedly over the years, then things that motivate them, then what?
Okay, so we help them to understand the abilities that they like to use, the skills, so to speak, the subject matter that they're motivated to use. Then there are certain circumstances under which they like to operate. For example, I know you've come out of the newspaper business as a reporter. Can you imagine someone who's not motivated by time deadlines working in the newspaper business? Okay? Imagine a research scientist who's working at a bench lab, who's not motivated to work in a kind of an alone atmosphere. Imagine a salesperson who's not motivated by challenging situations or competitive situations, for example. And so there's certain circumstances that seem to heighten. It's sort of the icing on the cake for us. Then there are certain kind of relationships that the person is motivated to have. whether it be an individual contributor kind of relationship or an influencing kind of relationship or a managerial kind of relationship with others. And then the fifth is what we refer to as the central motivational thrust. It's kind of like the theme to the poem. The other four elements, the abilities, the subject matter, the circumstances, the relationship, are more or less present in most of the achievements. When we look at their achievements, we see them present, not necessarily all of them, but most of them. But the central motivational thrust is kind of, again, like the theme to the poem. It's inherent in every single one of the achievements. And it could be like to build, to occupy a position of power, to obtain status, to exploit potential, would be examples of that. And so you can look at people's, for example, a person's very diverse experiences in life, okay? But if you look at what's undercurrent of those diverse experiences, what you'll find in there is the central motivational thrust.
Someone, and I look back now, you're making me look inward, which I shouldn't be doing publicly, but I always think I knew I liked to write. I always wanted to be a newspaper reporter. I did that in high school, I did that in college, I did that after college. I always wanted to be in the media. I always have been. I'm doing what I enjoy doing. Am I a minority? What made me find this path that I feel I'm decent at, I'm earning a living at, versus, I mean, I could have ended up being a miserable plumber.
Well, I think that, some of it is luck. Some of it is just how we propel ourselves and the opportunities. When you look at the whole career counseling industry, which ties into what my background is that good career counseling doesn't say you ought to be a doctor or a lawyer or an Indian chief or a plumber or an electrician. Good career counseling should really enable a person to recognize the right opportunity when it presents itself. And so some people are better able to recognize the right opportunity and move towards it. Obviously, economics have something to do with it. If I've got to put bread on my table and a roof over my head, I may not be able to go after the opportunity that I'd like to. Obviously, if I have some sort of economic success, then I have more freedom to pursue, to pursue some of the things that I want to. Some people don't ever have that opportunity in terms of the option isn't presented to them in terms of they haven't put themselves in the right place at the right moment to see the opportunity. And then you got to look at success and satisfaction, and it's almost on a continuum. For example, some of it is in the mind or the eyes of the beholder. For example, if I'm working in a coal mine, for example, and I'm using maybe 5% of my motivated pattern, and I get out of the coal mine and I get a job in a store and I use 15% of my pattern, I could feel like I died and went to heaven. Okay? But if I'm in a job that's using 80 or 90% of my motivated pattern, and I lose that job and I find a position that has 50%, I could feel absolutely miserable. And so some of it is in the eyes of the beholder.
It's interesting, your company and Arthur Miller say that basically after doing all these studies over the years, people aren't going to change. If you're not a team player when you're 10 or 12 or 15, you probably won't be a team player when you're 50. Or
Right.
If you're not motivated to write and your job requires writing, you're not going to like it. Does this ever change? Can people learn to adapt?
Well, people can learn to adapt, and obviously people who are motivated to adapt
Because they have to put food on the table.
They adapt all the time, and that's part of their whole style. What we really say, we use the phrase, Art uses the phrase that people don't change, but he's not really using it in the same way that the rest of the world is using it. I would describe that people change the way a snowball changes. There's a core. If you take snow and you pack it and you make it into a snowball and you start to roll it, okay, and then it becomes the head of a snowman. So it looks very different from the outside, but the core of it stays the same. So if I'm a builder or a developer, and so maybe I'm as a little kid I'm building with blocks, and then maybe later on I build teams and groups and organizations. I'm involved in maybe student government, for example, and then I get a little bit older and maybe I'm building concepts and ideas. And so I've made some very dramatic changes in my life and my career. But the building block of it, the cornerstone of it, is say, a building and developing theme that doesn't change. It just evolves and it grows and it develops more.
Steve Darter is with us. He's president of People Management in Simsbury, Connecticut. We'll find out how he puts this all to work in real life after these messages. And thank you for staying with us. Steve Darter is our guest this morning, and he is president of People Management, Simsbury, Connecticut. What do? You may ask. Well, he has a process. His company has a process that helps you find out what you enjoy in life, what you'll be good at doing, whether you're a team player, a leader, a follower, what subjects you like to work with, what motivates you to work. That's probably going to make your life a lot easier when you head out to work on a Monday morning. Steve, people don't change, though. Arthur Miller said in his book, The Truth About You, and Arthur Miller is the founder of the company, if you just tuned in, that, well, basically, I think he sort of had the theory that everything is almost preordained by God, that people are cast in concrete long before they enter the workforce, and that people never change. Tell me a little bit more about Arthur Miller and his philosophy and his book.
Well, you can't help but sit on our end of the process in terms of seeing themes within people and ask the question, where does it come from? And you could put sociological explanation on it. You could put a psychological explanation. Certainly, all the work that's being done on genetics and inheritance can put a very strong biological explanation on it. Art has very strong religious values, and he puts a very strong biblical explanation on it. He feels that these are gifts from God. But he, even the way he speaks in terms of using the natural biological systems. If you go back again to those studies from the University of Minnesota, which are really radically changing the way psychology is looking at people, they're not. The age-old question was always nature versus nurture, in terms of environments versus genes, and they're not presenting it in terms of an either-or. What they're presenting, their evidence or their findings, is in terms of how much of our medical history, for example, is genetically ordained and how much of it is environment, how much of our career direction is genetically ordained and how much of it is environment. And so they're trying to put a 60% or 70%, and so what they've concluded is that people have some very, very natural proclivities about them. Another study, major study that was done, took children who were adopted before age 3 months, and they did a lot of study and testing of these children 18 years later now, these children in comparison to their siblings who were not natural but adopted siblings, and they found incredible dissimilarity between them on the studies. Then they looked at these kids who were adopted and they compared them to their adoptive parents, and they found incredible dissimilarity between them. And then they did the same tests and the same studies on the natural parents and their and their natural children, and they found a lot of similarity, in the tests. And so what it's saying is that people are born with something, or seemingly are born with something that they evolve and they develop. And so again, it's not so much that they don't change, and it's not that it's so preordained that that your life is laid out, but it's that there are some natural gifts and talents that seem to be given to all of us, and we recognize it. We recognize it in Michael Jordan. We recognize it in a natural-born salesman and a natural-born teacher. But think, think about going to a restaurant. Now, we went to a restaurant last night, and we had just an absolutely terrific waiter, and how good you respond, or anyone responds when someone is naturally suited for their job. What about the person who's just a good listener? And so that person doesn't stand out as easily as the natural athlete, for example, or the natural organizer, or the person who has an ability to just write things concretely, not creative writing, but just concretely. So all of us have natural abilities. And it's a matter of whether we can identify them and build upon them and capitalize upon them. And then if companies are smart about managing their employees, then they also, if they recognize those abilities, they'd end up with a lot less management problems because people are doing what they naturally want to do. And I was saying during the break, when people aren't being used in work, if their natural abilities aren't being used in work, you find that they end up using these motivated abilities outside of work.
The guy that goes and plays basketball at noon every day.
Yeah, or the person, for example, who is working at some job that he doesn't enjoy, and at home, and when he gets home, he goes down to the basement and he builds fine furniture. Or the woman who's in a job that she doesn't like, but she's involved in fundraising activities, when she gets out of work, and she calls on people and she influences them and she persuades them, and here are skills that aren't necessarily being used at work, but are being used avocationally.
When you were talking earlier about the SEMA process, where you find out what makes people work, what their strengths are, their motivation are, what they get satisfaction from, does this apply only to the workforce then, or might it apply to people going to school, to college, or in marriages and family life?
Well, the way our company has evolved over time is people have experienced this, and then they've led our company in different directions. And so there are some marriage and family counselors, for example, who see in particular the relationship aspect of this process being very important. For example, if I'm very team-oriented, and we'll say my wife is very non-team-oriented, which is not true, but if it were, she might be saying to me, "Why do you always have to be with people?" And I might say, "Why do you always want to stay home alone?" And so you end up getting into finger pointing, and not accepting the naturalness of each other and trying to find a resolution. Same thing when we try to resolve conflict within corporation between boss and subordinate. It's the same kind of relationship. Work, when we talk about work is a paid activity. When we talk about leisure, we're talking about non-paid work. And so in terms of working with people who are retiring, for example, so they put in 40 or 50 years or whatever in work, and now all of a sudden they have all this time on their hands. What do they do with it? Okay. So when we're working at something that we enjoy doing, and we feel we do well, we feel a sense of who we are. We feel a sense of our own power and our own worth. And so we're trying to help people to capture, those kind of moments.
Is it important for people to satisfy themselves or satisfy their bosses? And is both possible?
Well, well, for example, if someone is motivated to meet needs and requirements, then he or she's going to find great satisfaction in meeting the requirements of the boss. If someone is motivated to create and to realize their own concepts and their own ideas, they're going to be less motivated to meet the requirements of their boss. They're going to be more motivated to meet the image that's in their own minds, for example. So we're all some of the truisms that that the world throws on people, in terms of recognition or climb up the pyramid and things like that, don't necessarily hold true for all people in all situations.
Do most people realize this? Do most bosses or superiors realize this? Are we good at seeing what we ourselves are capable of doing or what our employees are capable of doing?
I think good natural managers recognize it intuitively, because the essence of good management is accomplishing things through other people. And so if I'm a natural manager, if I read people naturally, then I intuitively know this. And then, for example, when a good manager gets hold of our process, it enables them to manage more effectively, for example. A lot of the managers that we end up working with who go through this process find it personally very beneficial and very insightful. And they hadn't thought in terms of that if I have a natural pattern to me, and I recognize, and I can clearly see my natural pattern, and I can see where I'm motivated and I can see where I'm demotivated, then it's very logical that my employees have a natural pattern as well, and they're going to be motivated and demotivated. Now it becomes whether I end up using that insight. Most people that we end up working with end up looking at people just a little bit differently. They end up looking at their children differently. They end up looking at their relatives and their spouse differently. Because we tend to not think about people as being unique and different, often at least. At times we do, but we tend not to accept people for the value. We tend to want to change people.
To fit our mold.
Yeah, kids always want to change their parents. For example, employees often want to change their bosses. Bosses often want to change their employees, because we're really trying to shape people or change people or hold an image of the way people ought to be, rather than recognizing the uniqueness of people and then utilizing that uniqueness.
If we've got a square peg in a round hole, so to speak, Is that person more likely to have a lot of stress? Is that going to come out in the workplace? How does stress relate to what we're talking about?
Well, people used to think in terms of stress that if someone is working 12 hours a day and has a zillion things on his plate, that's a type A personality and subject to heart attack. Well, but there's some people who are only motivated and only feeling fulfilled and satisfied when they got a 12-hour day and a zillion things on their plate. You take that kind of person and you put him in a job where she or he needs to work, at a very slow pace, not with a lot of things. That would end up creating more stress for that person. And likewise, if you take someone who likes to sit down and chew the fat and be comfortable and casual and move at a slower pace, and you put that person in a very fast-paced environment, that person would be a candidate for stress. So you look at people in terms of fit and environment, and you say, are they well suited for the position and the environment that they're in? If they're not well suited, it's likely to cause stress. And then the evidence out there indicates that a sustained time to a lot of stress does cause some medical problems.
In this economy, a lot of people are losing their jobs, changing jobs, looking for jobs. Is this a good chance for people to sit down and say, wait a minute, maybe I wasn't all that happy being a civil engineer for the city of Holyoke or whatever, and maybe I really want to be a freelance writer?
Well, I think it's always a good time to sit down and try to determine what is it that I'm really good at, what is it you're really good at, and where ought I go to utilize those abilities. You've got a very difficult economy out there where a lot of options are not necessarily open just because of the way the economy is, and there aren't necessarily that many jobs out there. But that doesn't mean that people ought to give up and sort of die inside. What it means is that people ought to understand and recognize what they're good at, what they're motivated to do, and try to move towards it. And maybe for practical reasons they can't move towards it now, but that doesn't mean that they can't keep their eyes and their ears open. It also doesn't mean that work needs to be the most fulfilling thing in one's life. Someone can work to put bread on the table and then find greater satisfaction outside of work. That's not the ideal, but in this economy, if you can't get a job doing what you really motivated to do, at least don't let that kill you inside. End up trying to utilize some of those motivated abilities that you have outside of work, for example.
Steve Darter, we have to take one more break, and we'll be back.
The talk station AM 640 continues with Conversations with Cele on WNNZ.
And our guest this morning on Conversations with Cele is Stephen M. Darter, President of People Management, Simsbury, Connecticut. We've been talking about how to find out what people enjoy, what motivates them, how they can find happiness or fit into their job a little bit better. Can anybody just come down? You primarily deal with large corporations, but let's say there's an individual who's had a top CEO job and he's looking for a change. Can he come to you for testing and find out what he might enjoy doing in his later years?
Over the years, as you work with someone that the company has sponsored, and they've learned something about themselves, they've called us and said, I'd like to have my spouse or my niece or my nephew or my son or my daughter. And so we've evolved a program that's aimed at individuals. And yes, individuals can come to us. What we do is we try to make the process much less expensive. We end up doing everything on tape and not transcribing and not writing a report. So we'll interview the person on tape, and then we'll give them feedback in terms of the process, in terms of the motivated pattern that we see on tape. And then we also help them to explore the questions that they come with, whether it be career or educational questions or what have you. And then we give the tape to the person. And, so yes, we do try to respond to individuals.
Roughly what's the cost?
But we really base it on an hourly basis, and roughly it could be maybe $300, $400. Keep in mind that the cost when we work with corporations, and we we sit down and we spend 2 hours or more interviewing a person, and then we transcribe, and then our case writer spends a day and a half writing a report, and then we send the report, and we're doing at least one and often two feedbacks within the company. We're consuming a large number of hours, and so the cost normally to corporations is in the neighborhood of around $2,000 when we work with somebody.
What's your success rate in putting round pegs into round holes?
In terms of the executive search side, our success rate is very, very high. We did a survey recently of all the searches that we worked on over a 5-year period, and somewhere, I can't remember, but it was somewhere around 80 or 90% were either still in the jobs or promoted.
Conversations with Cele on WNNZ.